I just asked for water, and my daughter shouted, "We are not your servant, a glass of water," and the art of learning lessons. Or, how one simple request changed everything rather dramatically. Now then, settle in comfortably, would you? This is one of those stories that starts with something perfectly ordinary, a glass of water, if you can believe it, and ends up somewhere rather extraordinary indeed. It's the sort of tale that proves, once again, that life has a peculiar sense of timing, and an even more peculiar sense of justice. You know how it is when you've been in hospital, don't you? That particular sort of exhaustion that settles into your bones like morning mist in a valley. Well, our gentleman, let's call him Peter, shall we, had just endured 3 days of the NHS's finest care, following what the doctors rather cheerfully termed a bit of heart surgery. The sort of procedure that involves stopping said heart twice on the operating table, though apparently disqualified as merely routine in the modern medical world. Peter had barely settled into his favorite armchair. You know the one. Every proper home has it, slightly worn around the edges and perfectly molded to one's particular shape, when he made what seemed like a perfectly reasonable request. "Could you bring me a glass of water?" Now, I don't know about you, but having just spent 3 days in hospital with one's chest held together by what amounts to surgical string, this strikes me as rather modest behavior, not demanding champagne or 4-course meal. Mind you, just water. The sort of thing any decent family member might offer without being asked. His daughter Haley, bless her, was pottering about in the kitchen doorway when this earth-shattering request was made. And here's where our story takes its first interesting turn. Rather than expect, of course, Dad, or even a simple right away, what emerged from her lips was something altogether different. Seriously? I just got home from the hospital. Well, Peter's voice came out rather weaker than he'd intended, the sort of voice one develops after having one's ribcage temporarily rearranged by surgeons. "I'm asking for water." Now, Kian, that's a son-in-law, and yes, the name did make me pause as well, was completely absorbed in the television, remote control balance on his lap, like some sort of domestic scepter, watching what I can only assume was one of those dreadful game shows where people shriek with joy over winning toasters. "The kitchen's right there," Haley announced with the sort of gesture one might use to direct traffic. "You've got legs. You've got legs." Rather like telling someone who's just had their roof repaired that they've got a ladder, isn't it? Peter gripped his armchair, the faithful old thing, and began the apparently Herculean task of standing up. Sharp pain shot across his chest like accusations, and his vision did that wobbly thing that happens when one's body is still negotiating with recent trauma. The surgical site screamed its protests, and for a moment, Peter wondered if he might simply collapse on his own carpet like a deflated balloon. "Easy there, Dad," came Haley's voice, carrying all the warmth of a parking ticket. "Don't want you falling and making even more work for us." More work. As if tending to one's recovering father was some sort of unreasonable burden thrust upon him by cruel fate, rather than, I don't know, basic human decency. Behind him, as he began his epic journey to the kitchen, all of 6 feet, but feeling rather like crossing the Sahara in Wellington boots, he could hear his daughter's commentary. "Next thing you know, he'll want us to cook his meals too." "Don't give him ideas," came Kian's response, accompanied by the sort of chuckle that contains absolutely no mirth whatsoever. Now, I've heard some things in my time, but this particular exchange stopped Peter dead in his tracks. These weren't the temporary frustrations of stressed children, you understand. This was who they actually were when they thought nobody was listening. Or perhaps, and this is a rather chilling bit, when they simply didn't care if he could hear. Peter reached the kitchen counter and gripped its edge, not just for physical support, but for the sort of emotional steadying one needs when the world suddenly shifts on its axis. The glass trembled in his hand as he filled it from the tap. The same tap he'd been using for 20 years, but somehow the water had never tasted quite so bitter. When he turned around, they were both watching him with expressions that mixed impatience with something that looked remarkably like disgust. His own daughter was regarding him the way one might look at an inconvenient stranger who'd wandered uninvited into one's sitting room. The glass felt heavy in his hand, though not from its weight. No, this was the weight of understanding settling into his bones like winter cold. Here was a man who'd built this very house with his own hands, paid for his daughter's education without question, covered her wedding costs. nearly 20,000 pounds, if you can imagine, and even sorted out their car payments when Kian's business venture went the way of most enthusiastic but poorly planned enterprises. And they couldn't manage a glass of water after heart surgery. That evening, Peter found himself in his bedroom, the sanctuary he'd once shared with his late wife, Sarah, where they planned their future and dreamed their dreams. Lying on the bed that had welcomed him home from hospital, he stared at the ceiling and let memory do what memory does best. Flood back exactly when you need it most. 5 years earlier, after Sarah's funeral, he'd sat in this very spot, making one of the most significant decisions of his life. The life insurance payout had been substantial, enough to buy something modest for himself and help his daughter start her married life properly. He remembered his hands shaking as he signed those deed transfer papers at the solicitor's office. "Dad, this is too much," Haley had whispered through tears that day. "We can't accept this." But he'd insisted. Family takes care of family, he'd told her. Your mother would have wanted you to have security. Kian had shaken his hand with what seemed like genuine gratitude, promising that Peter would always have a place there, that they'd look after him when he got older. Those promises now felt rather like smoke, dissipating in the harsh afternoon light. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, feeling like an unwelcome guest in what had once been his own home, surrounded by furniture he'd bought and photos of memories he'd paid to create. Saturday morning brought Michael O'Connor, Peter's solicitor, arriving promptly at 10 with his well-worn leather briefcase and the sort of professional manner that speaks of weekend sacrifices made without complaint. A decent chap, Michael, who'd handled the original house transfer and understood both family dynamics and the sometimes messy business of property law. "You mentioned family concerns on the phone," Michael said, settling into the chair across from Peter's with practiced efficiency. Peter had rehearsed this conversation during his sleepless hours, choosing words that would convey necessity without revealing too much emotion. Rather British of him, really. "I need to review the legal standing of the house gift I made to my daughter 5 years ago." Michael's eyebrows lifted slightly, not with surprise, mind you, but with the recognition of someone who'd seen this particular drama before. He pulled out the files: deed transfer, gift documentation, tax forms. All the paperwork that had seemed so straightforward when love and generosity were doing the driving. "The house is completely yours, Mr. Richardson." Peter blinked. "Excuse me? Legally speaking, you retain full ownership rights." Michael's finger traced across a specific paragraph with the precision of someone reading a particularly interesting recipe. The transfer was structured as a conditional gift with reversionary provisions, standard practice for family property transfers. Well, this was news to Peter. 5 years ago, Michael had insisted on these protections, explaining them as standard safeguards. But Peter had been rather too eager to provide for his daughter's future to pay much attention to the fine print. What does that mean exactly? While Haley holds a title, the property reverts to you automatically under certain specified conditions. Material change in circumstances, failure to provide agreed-upon care or housing, breach of family obligations. The implications crystallize like frost forming on a window pane. Rather poetic justice, wouldn't you say? That evening, armed with this newfangled legal knowledge, Peter positioned himself strategically near the kitchen when Haley and Kian returned from their weekly shopping expedition. Time for what one might call a small experiment in human nature. "Could you grab me a glass of water while you're up?" Haley's transformation from neutral daughter to irritated household dictator happened with the efficiency of a traffic light change. "Can't you get it yourself?" "I'm still recovering from surgery. It would really help." Kian looked up from his phone with the expression of someone whose valuable time was being wasted. "What's the big deal about walking a few more steps?" "Seriously, Dad," Haley added with the sort of sigh usually reserved for explaining things to particularly slow children, "you can't expect us to wait on you hand and foot just because you had a medical procedure." Medical procedure. Rather like calling the Battle of Britain a spot of bad weather, isn't it? Perfect. They'd failed the test with what one might generously call flying colors. 20 minutes later, Peter stood in the living room doorway and made his decision. Sometimes, life requires us to be rather more decisive than we're naturally inclined to be. "I need you both to leave my house." The silence that followed had the quality of that moment just before lightning strikes. Haley's magazine slipped from her fingers like a guilty secret. What did you just say? Her voice carried a dangerous edge Peter had never heard before. Rather like discover your pet cat can actually speak, and what it has to say isn't particularly pleasant. This is my house. I want you to pack your things and find somewhere else to live. What followed was a masterclass in family manipulation that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. They physically guided Peter to his bedroom. Guided being rather a euphemism for forced. Locked him in, and when he managed to call the police through his neighbor Joshua, decent chap Joshua, they convinced the responding officers that Peter was confused from his surgery. Quite brilliant, really. If you appreciate that sort of thing from an academic standpoint, 90 minutes in that locked bedroom gave Peter time to think, and his thoughts led him to a decision that his recently repaired heart probably wouldn't recommend. The window beckoned like a challenge he couldn't ignore. 15 feet to the ground. For a healthy person, manageable. For someone 5 days out of heart surgery, rather like attempting Everest in carpet slippers. But remaining imprisoned in his own home seemed a considerably worse fate than risking a tumble. The flower bed below offered some mercy. Soft soil rather than concrete. Small blessings for desperate people, as they say. He pushed one leg through the opening, then the other, until he sat on the windowsill like an elderly burglar planning what was surely the most pathetic break-in in criminal history. The ground seemed considerably farther away from this angle, and he wondered briefly if despair always felt quite so much like standing on the edge of something with no good options. The fall rattled every bone in his body, but when no immediate disaster announced itself, he struggled his feet and dusted off his dignity along with the soil. Moving around his own house like some sort of senior citizen ninja, Peter avoided the gravel path and motion sensor with the stealth skills he hadn't needed since childhood games of hide-and-seek. At the front door, he crouched carefully and lifted the doormat. The spare key sat exactly where he placed it 3 years ago, a simple precaution that now seemed rather providential. Inside, the house felt different. No longer a prison, but not quite a home either. Something in between, a battlefield where the first skirmish had gone badly, but the war was far from over. From the living room came the relaxed sounds of his daughter and son-in-law discussing weekend plans. Ordinary household conversation between people who believed they'd successfully neutralized what they saw as a threat to their comfortable existence. Sunday morning brought Peter back to Michael's office, which seemed that day like a sanctuary of polished wood and legal reference books, order in a world that had temporarily lost its balance. "You look like you haven't slept much," Michael observed, pouring coffee from a thermos he brought from home. Peter explained the evening's events. The confrontation, the confinement, the police call that had backfired rather spectacularly. Michael listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "So they physically locked you in your own bedroom and convinced responding officers that you were confused due to surgery." Michael's tone carried the sort of professional outrage that felt enormously validating. "Exactly. They're rather skilled at manipulation, and they used my medical condition against me." Michael leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in that classic lawyer pose. "This changes everything. What we discussed yesterday as a possibility has now become a necessity." The efficiency of legal machinery felt rather intoxicating after the chaos of family manipulation. Here were rules, procedures, deadlines, things that couldn't be argued away with crocodile tears and claims of post-surgical confusion. "How long before this is final?" Peter asked. "Assuming they don't contest, and I suspect they won't once they understand the legal reality, you could have full possession back within 60 days. However, the psychological impact will be immediate. They'll realize that their control over the situation was always rather an illusion." Monday morning arrived with official documents printed on Michael O'Connor's letterhead. Peter stood in the living room holding papers that would change everything, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim what had always been his. Haley was in the kitchen making coffee with the casual confidence of someone who believed she owned the house around her. Kian sat scrolling through his phone, probably planning his day without any awareness that his world was about to collapse rather dramatically. "Haley, Kian, I need you both in here." His voice carried an authority they hadn't heard before, not the confused, pleading tone of a sick old man asking for water, but the firm command of someone holding all the cards. "These are eviction notices. You have 72 hours to remove yourselves and all your belongings from my property. The silence was profound. Haley's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips, suspended in disbelief. Peter unfolded the documents and began reading with the satisfaction of someone who'd been looking forward to this moment. Notice of gift revocation. Pursuant to Washington state property law, the undersigned property owner hereby revokes the gift deed executed in favor of Haley Richardson on grounds of material ingratitude and breach of implied conditions. What followed was a symphony of protests, pleading, and threats that would have been rather entertaining if it weren't so tragically predictable. But Peter wasn't finished. Oh no, not by a long shot. Tuesday afternoon found them sitting around the kitchen table like a family again, though the dynamic had shifted rather completely since Monday morning. Peter placed a manila folder on the table, documents they'd never seen before. Tell me, Haley, do you remember how I was able to buy this house? Your savings from the contracting business, she replied, uncertainty creeping into her voice like fog rolling in from the sea. Peter opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Official letterhead from Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. Death certificates. Beneficiary claim forms. All dated 5 years ago. This house was bought with the insurance money from your mother's death. The silence that followed was the sort you get in cathedrals and libraries, absolute and rather sacred in its completeness. £350,000, paid out 6 months after the funeral. Your mother maintained that policy for 20 years specifically to provide security for our family. Haley made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The insurance papers slipped from her fingers like autumn leaves. She died believing she was providing security for our family. She talked about it during her final weeks, how the insurance money would ensure we always had a safe place to live, that we would take care of each other. Peter gathered the documents back into a neat pile with the precision of someone making a very important point. She made me promise to use that money to keep our family together. I didn't know, Haley whispered. You didn't know because I protected you from that knowledge, just as your mother protected us with that policy. This house, where you locked me in a bedroom, where you told police I was mentally incompetent, where you refused to bring me water after heart surgery, was purchased with money from your mother's life insurance policy. The weight of moral reality settled over them like one of those heavy blankets they use in hospitals. This wasn't just about legal ownership or family disputes anymore. This was about violating the sacred trust of a woman who died believing her sacrifice would protect the people she loved most. What can we do? Haley whispered. How can we make this right? Peter looked at his daughter, his broken, desperate daughter who had finally understood the full scope of what she'd lost, and felt something that might have been pity mixed with the satisfaction of justice finally being served. You have 44 hours, he said simply. Thursday afternoon brought the sound of cardboard boxes being taped shut and furniture being moved across hardwood floors. Peter sat in his recliner, watching them work with the quiet efficiency of people who had finally accepted their fate. Gone was the arrogance, the entitlement, the casual cruelty that had defined their relationship since the surgery. In its place was genuine remorse mixed with the hollow exhaustion of people who'd learned what it meant to lose everything. The house keys lay on the coffee table between them, still attached to the keychain Haley had bought when he first gave her the house 5 years ago. A little silver charm reading, Home Sweet Home. Rather ironic, wouldn't you say, considering how sweet this home had proven not to be for the man who'd made it all possible. These belong to you, Haley whispered as she handed him the keys with trembling fingers. They always did. She nodded, understanding the deeper truth in those words. This house had always been his. Legally, morally, and in every way that mattered. She had simply been allowed to live there through his generosity, a generosity she had repaid with contempt and cruelty. Will you ever forgive us? She asked at the threshold. That's not the question you should be asking, Peter replied with the gentle firmness of someone who'd learned a thing or two about life. The question is whether you'll remember this lesson well enough to treat the next person with the kindness you should have shown me. The door closed with a soft click of finality. Through the window, Peter watched them load their remaining belongings into their car and drive away from a property that would never again be their home. Silence settled over the house like a comfortable blanket. For the first time in almost a week, Peter was alone in his own home without the weight of family tension or the threat of being treated like an unwelcome stranger in his own domain. He looked down at the keys in his hand, then at the insurance papers still scattered across the coffee table. Sarah would have been proud to see justice finally served, to know that her sacrifice had ultimately protected the family she'd loved, even if it had taken longer than anyone might have expected. Walking to the rooms of his house, truly his house again, Peter felt something he hadn't experienced since before his surgery. Peace. Not the peace of revenge, mind you, but the deeper satisfaction of justice properly served and lessons properly learned. Outside, the spring afternoon continued its gentle progression towards evening, and Peter was home. You know, there's something rather satisfying about stories like this, isn't there? Not because we enjoy seeing families torn apart. Heaven knows there's enough of that in the world. But because sometimes the right thing happens for the right reasons. It's the sort of tale that reminds us that kindness isn't just a nice idea. It's the foundation upon which all decent relationships are built. When we treat the people we love as inconveniences rather than blessings, well, we shouldn't be terribly surprised when the universe decides to teach us a lesson about consequences. Peter's story isn't really about eviction notices or legal technicalities. It's about the simple truth that how we treat people matters, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. A glass of water, freely given, costs almost nothing, but refusing it, well, as Haley and Kian discovered, that can cost everything. And somewhere, I like to think, Sarah's having a quiet cup of tea and nodding approvingly at how things worked out in the end. Because that's what love does, isn't it? It protects the people we care about, even when we're no longer here to do it ourselves. Rather beautiful when you think about it. In a world that often seems rather short on both justice and kindness, it's rather comforting to know that sometimes, just sometimes, things work out exactly as they should. Now then, shall we put the kettle on? All this talk of justice has made me rather thirsty, and I suspect you could do with a proper cup of tea yourself.